introductory remarks, you can see who the three speakers are and their qualifications. We decided to do away with honorifics, so I'm refer to them as Joseph and Katerina, and Richard. I'm Bren, and you'll hear, I want to leave a lot of room for us to have public discussion. So I'm going to say 2 or 3 sentences. We will turn it over to Joe Kenichi and then Katerina, and then followed by Richard Wood. When I read these 3 essays, I was completely engrossed. It seemed to me a perfect way to kick off this discussion. We're going to start with Joseph to talk about who's rooted his remarks in the years since Vatican II. All 3 of them are going to be talking, I think, about what it means, what it will mean to be Catholic in the 21st century. But all 3 root their remarks again in socio-historical contexts. In my opinion, the way I see this panel forming is that we're going to look at the 45 minutes, not 45 minutes, seems like 45 minutes, 45 years after Vatican II, and then we're going to look how this plays out, and especially in the United States, on 2 levels. One is the parochial level, and one is the public context. And this makes perfect sense to me, because we've got these 2, these are the fields, the playing fields, where we talk about what it means to be Catholic, what it looks like to be Catholic, what it means to be Catholic in a pluralistic society. So with those remarks, I'm going to invite, I think people are either going to sit or stand or be projected as they feel comfortable. And Joseph, we could start with you.
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's very nice to be here, and I'd like to thank Mark and Patricia, the organizing people, and also great donors who have been generous. Thank you very much. Historians don't do future. This is what I told them at the beginning of this morning. But we can hopefully identify trajectories and trends and changes that the future inherits and that shapes the future of Catholicism. So I approach it as an historian. I think some of it will be familiar to you. In contrast to the public configuration that marked the Church in the United States from the new Code of Canon Law in 1917 to the eve of the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic community in the United States has developed in the last 60 years an overly pluriform public presence. This chapter traces the development of this now institutionalized division by examining the emergence of 2 distinct ecumenisms since the Council. They may be taken as exemplifying the overall pattern of pluriformity that has developed around the understanding of authority, priesthood, the role of women, family life, pastoral practice, and engagement in public policy. A consensus ecumenism designed to address the elements shared with mainline Protestants and the Jewish community emerged first in the immediate wake of the Council. Shared patterns of worship, scripture, dialogue, and theological agreement between Catholics and Protestants moved the three religious traditions towards similar internal and external patterns. Parallel, cooperative, and mutually reinforcing social values and projects were forged in the context of the Civil Rights Movement, the War on Poverty, and public protest against involvement in Vietnam. This consensus ecumenism began to break apart in the wake of the Roe v. Wade legalization of a woman's reproductive rights. Protestant congregational bodies split with their Roman Catholic ecumenical counterparts. The decade of the 1980s saw a struggle for public dominance over the interpretation of religious presence in society, both within and without the Church. In the 1990s, a second, very different public presence of a Catholic evangelical ecumenical alliance emerged. This second ecumenical alliance stressed not globalization, but American exceptionalism, not the social safety net, but the free market society, not interreligious and intercultural values, but the preservation of Western European civilization, not dialogue, but socio-moral absolutes, not inclusive civil rights, but social order, not adaptation to changing social mores, but a transcendent moral pole, not the fraternal family tradition, but the paternal family tradition. The public presence approaches of the two ecumenisms have become institutionalized in episcopal appointments, networks of lay influence, think tanks, academic institutions, parish life, and distinctive publications. In addition, during the last 60 years, the community of believers has entered into a new politics of history, one beyond the hierarchical structures of Christendom. Various groups and different ecumenisms in the church have adopted the tools of contemporary political democracy. Mobilization of public opinion through the adroit use of the printed and social media, mass petitions, direct mailing, adversarial positioning, image control, public protest actions, divergent narrative interpretations of the same events, moral vilification of the opponent, pressure tactics through alliance with organizational power points, the monetization and networking of a socio-religious vision. All of this has become the public currency of exchange between members of the same ecclesial body. These developments, the emergence of two ecumenisms and the adoption of the methodologies associated with the new politics of history, are only examples of wider approaches now built into the fabric of the community. The pluralism within Catholicism, traditionally associated with the theology, pastoral policies, and governance of religious orders, and the bishops and laity associated with them, has migrated into the community at large. Pluriformity has become democratized and laicized. Spaces where contraries are mediated have disappeared. The broad middle, where Catholicism is viewed as an historically conditioned and oscillating system of contraries, not contradictories, has been hollowed out. I'll repeat that. It has implications for the future. The broad middle, where Catholicism is viewed as an historically conditioned and oscillating system of contraries, not contradictories, has been hollowed out. The Church of the 21st century will more deeply incorporate this institutionalized pluriformity into its identity. This is the problem Pope Francis is attempting to address through his pastoral actions of dialogue and accompaniment, his focus on the poor, the spiritual centrality of conversion and the following of Christ, synodality, and the image of the church as a polyhedron in which equal but distinct parts are interrelated with each other through a complex system of mediating theological, spiritual, ecclesiological, and social exchanges. The vision has yet to be adopted by what continue to be divergent and adversarial positions amongst the bishops, priests, and laity in the United States. The situation of public pluriformity will demand a change in the inherited definition of hierarchy and in the community's definition of what it means to be Catholic. Yet coming to grips with the pluriformity and creating mediating intellectual, social, and pastoral spaces where Catholicism becomes a communion of diverse peoples marked by creedal unity but organizational humility, charity, and mutual trust, opens the door to the global mission of the Church in America. This is easily the most democratized and pluralistic country in the world, but this is a global church, which is pluriform. If we can establish a means and methodology for how to handle our own pluralism, we can make a contribution to the global church. If we don't handle it well, we will have no contribution to make at all. As the church in the United States adopts to this new institutionalized pluriformity, it has the opportunity, through leadership and hard work, to make credible to others a God who through the Son and the Spirit, in humility and charity, has entered into a pluriform world enmeshed within the politics of history. This is the spiritual and ecclesial task ahead. Thank you.
So we'll move on to the second speaker. Let me just interject. I saw my colleague Susan Ross look at me saying, it's been more than 45 years since Vatican II. What I was doing was referring, actually, I'm not blame it on you. When I was reading Joseph's essay, he said, I'm going to deal with the past 45 years, and so I wrote that in my notes. So I got it. So apologies, reorient. All right, thank you.
That was a wonderful way to begin. It's always nice to be a second, although second to someone who is so well prepared and so knowledgeable is not the easiest thing in the world. And I extend thanks, as Joe did, to all kinds of folks who made this possible, and add the hospitality of Loyola and Michael especially for making this such a wonderful event. The task that I was given as far as the chapter that I wrote about was about who pastors, that simple word, who pastors. And the subtitle, the priest, the context, and the ministry, sort of guided how I wrote about this. I recognize that there are lots of people who pastor in different ways, but I'm looking at it from the point of view of the formal term of pastor, that is the appointed person leading a particular parish. So that with that context in mind, but also recognizing the pastoring is a very broad gift given to lots of people, thank God. So I'm going to speak in about three parts of my presentation, and they connect, I think, with one another quite well. First of all, to give a few facts about who the priests are who are currently in pastoral positions, and to say a few words about how they provide leadership. There are different ways of providing leadership. Then the second part is to look at the cultural and ecclesial context. And Joe did a wonderful job of introducing that and the changes that have taken place. So that helps a lot to elaborate that second part of my presentation. And then the third part is to see what kinds of adaptation need to happen in order for the leadership to be effective or more effective. And that leadership comes from many places, but from those who are the leaders themselves, that is the pastors, from the bishops, but also from, most importantly, from lay people who far outnumber the first two categories. And I'm particularly interested in young people, and I can look over here and see a little cluster of young people, which is quite wonderful. And to know that that is really our future, and how you will carry the church forward is extremely important to the future of the church. So, first of all, a little bit of a very brief profile of who priests are. Over half of the priests in this country are over 65. So, half. That means that most of the priests who are currently ministering in a parish were born either after Vatican II, or they were only about, the oldest they could have been was about 15. So Vatican II isn't in their bones, and that becomes a very important factor. The average age now of priests being ordained is about 6 or 7 years older than it used to be. It was around 27 to 28. Now it's more 36, 37. And so they have fewer years and are more established already in their way of thinking by the time they arrive at seminaries. Because of the number of priests who are turning 65 and older, very large numbers of them in recent, let's say, 10 years or so. It means that the new priests are becoming pastors within 3 to 5 years with very little opportunity for any kind of apprenticeship, and that has made a serious difference that the church has not really considered very well in providing ongoing education that would be so necessary. Another factor about who are the priests, they are now 30%, close to 30% international, and the proportion of seminarians is at least 30%. And that matches, in a way, the number of immigrants who are enhancing the numbers of Catholics in this country, except that the number of Hispanic or Latina immigrants far outnumber any other group, and the number of the priests or the seminarians are by no means that proportion. So it's different from what it used to be when the Italians or the Germans or the French or Irish especially, I suppose, came with their own pastors. Now the international pastors are having to deal with people that they're very unfamiliar with, creating a lot of difficulties. So there's a lot more that can be said about that, and I will do that in the question and answer time. But I want to say just a few words about how leadership is provided. Older and younger generations of priests have remarkably different approaches to ministry and to the relationship with the people to whom they are ministering. And I also want to say at this point, when I say, the younger and older generations, obviously there are some in the younger generation who are much more like the older generation and vice versa. That is, in their relationships with people. Some are much more involved with people. Their role in leadership is with the community, not on top of the community. So while there are people in each category, younger and older, who can be either kind of leader, they tend to be, the older ones tend to be much more community oriented. They tend to be much more the servant leaders. They recognize the gifts of the community, and they model that way of involving people in the ministry of the church. The younger, and people are sometimes called the older priests Vatican II priests, the younger ones the John Paul II priests. And that date that Joe gave of 1990 being a kind of a key time of change fits very well with this. By that time, Pope John Paul II was in office for about 15 years or close to that. And the priests coming through seminaries at that time took on a particular way of a particular approach to their future ministry. And they were much more, they had the idea of separating themselves, being above, and less community involvement. And it was the gifts of the priests that mattered more, and not so much the gifts of the people. Meanwhile, this is now 25 years after Vatican II ended, and so lay people are used to being quite involved, and so the clash begins to happen and has been exacerbated ever since. And that is between parishioners who are used to a Vatican II model, and the younger priests, the newly ordained, are much more in a different mode, in more the, what was termed John Paul II. So those are some of the ways of leadership. A wonderful project was engaged in with 4 or 5 lay organizations who work with the church, minister in the church. It's called Emerging Models of a Project. They gave 6 marks of excellence for the future. How to minister: collaborative, ethical, inclusive, pastoral, prophetic, and welcoming. Collaborative, ethical, such an important word in our times, inclusive, pastoral, prophetic, and welcoming. So that is the goal, and it is not exactly the picture that was that I painted so far of the younger generation especially. The second part, the cultural and ecclesial context, as I said, Joe said so many important things about that. I'll mention 3, already referred to in some sense in what I said already. The first is the demographic shifts to much more ethnic diversity. it's perhaps difficult to imagine we could be more ethnically diverse, but with the immense amount of immigration, especially from Asia, which was very different for us, but also from more and more from Central and South America. So immigration patterns deeply affected who the members of the church were. I don't think we've really adjusted to that very well yet, to this time. The second is a growth, growth of membership is unequally distributed across regions of the country. There has been tremendous relocation of Catholics. The Northeast and Midwest was the Catholic part of the country. Now the South and Southwest are very much more growing in population of Catholics. It lacks the resources, those parts of the country, Catholic colleges and universities, the Catholic Church's tradition. It just doesn't have the same kinds of financial and personnel resources and physical buildings, and we've not adapted very well to that either yet. So that change in where people are located has been tremendous. That has resulted in structural changes of very large urban parishes, huge, suburban especially. And then in rural areas where the population is declining, the upper Midwest and Northwest, multiple parishes are much more what's happening with them. And the multiple parishes, that is priests ministering to more than one parish. Over half of the parishes in the United States have a priest who has more than one parish. And about 25 to 30 or so % of the priests minister in that kind of a situation. And then the third point is the generational differences in attitudes toward the church. And it's very pronounced, the theological divisions between priests and people in a number of parishes. The parishes that were staffed by older pastors who were very much into the Vatican II mode, where a younger priest comes in and has this other idea, this cultic model, the sacral model, being in charge and so on, has dislocated the people in the parish and the workers in the parish. So many lay people, thank God, over 40,000 full-time at least, are working in parishes now. A huge change in the pastoring idea. So that's an enormous shift. There are a number of other things. With young people, I just want to say this, why don't young people go to church is sometimes asked. Fewer of their parents are practicing their faith. The Gen X parents and maybe the younger baby boomer parents are less likely to go to church. Science is dominant among young people. Science is more important than the Bible. Who can believe those stories in the Bible after all? And then the sexual abuse and the hypocrisy has been huge. And what I've heard from young people is that they're embarrassed to be Catholics, which is really a sad thing. So that's that point. Then finally, the new context, how do you adapt to the new context? So we have the dual role for pastors and parish workers, providing spiritual life for the parishioners, and organizing it, and then administering parish business. One of the things for the future that I think must happen is that priests have to stop administering the business of the parish. It's changed somewhat, but not in these rural dioceses with where the priest and maybe one part-time secretary or part-time janitor is all that is present. So they have to do everything. And I think canon law is stated in a way that ultimately the priest is responsible for everything. That can change. That the business person can be managing a lot of it. And it's happening some places, but much more of it has to happen. And I think generational needs have to be considered much more strongly than they are at present. Last night, Emily, who is present here, had a wonderful statement about who is listened to. And young people in general, I think, are not asked very often about their faith or about what they would like for the church. And especially young women are not asked that. I'm on a campus where we have a college seminary, large, and a moderate-sized theological level seminary. And you know, the bishops and other people come and they're always asking the seminarians about what they think about the church. Do they ever ask a group of lay students, or do they ever ask a group of women? I doubt it. I've not heard of it, and the women certainly don't tell me that. So we really need to shift that. And that adaptation means that the key word for the future, I think, is listening instead of talking at young people and at people in general. That whole idea that it's about, I think Cardinal Supich said this last night, it's about helping people form their consciences so that they make decisions, not telling them what to do. I taught undergrads for 26 years, and I also taught seminarians during the same period of time. And what, as we would talk, I taught either American religion or world religion to the undergrads. And what they would say is that when they ask they are not allowed to give their opinion. When they ask a question, they get an answer right away, especially from younger priests. They'd like to discuss. So in my class, which was 4 hours at night, so there was a lot of time to discuss, if not fall asleep. So you had to keep them going. But they loved to talk about what they thought of various points of view. They didn't have to hear, could you imagine listening to me for 4 hours? Anyway, they didn't do that. They were able to engage, and I invited them to do that. Nothing that you say is off limits. You could ask any question, and I'll do my best to answer it. I'll tell you what the church teaches. I'll tell you what other people say and what some Catholics say about this or that. They love that. They love to be heard, and I think we just have to do that a whole lot more. For priests, I think they have to bring balance to their lives, allow time for prayer, exercise, and something, play for time off. They have to learn to delegate more. And people, they have to lower the expectation of what they can do and also that people expect them to do. They cannot be at every single meeting in the parish. They can't do those sorts of things and miss other parts of conversation. Bishops need to plan, consult. They have to know their priests and know what their life is like. And they have to provide for ongoing formation. And then see to the assessment of parish life and of priests so that there's feedback and there can be a change and improvement. So those are some suggestions for the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we're going to hear from Richard Wood via the magic of modern technology. We hope.
Hi, good morning all. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Richard.
Yes.
Hi, Richard. Good to see you.
It's really a pleasure to join this panel with Joe and Katarina. Thank you, Bren, for hosting. Really smart, interesting papers to start. Look forward to the conversation. I do apologize for not being there in person. I'm serving as the interim provost at the University of New Mexico this year, and we have our big budget summit, so I just have to be here. Before I start, I'm going to do some kind of informal comments and then close with some more formal thoughts. Before I start, I just want to note that I'm going to talk a lot about public Catholicism, the notion of the public, and in using the term public, I speak as a sociologist. This comes out of democratic theory. Public here doesn't just mean what's visible, what's not private, but rather it's about all those settings in which people think together, engage in dialogue together about the nature of our society, the nature of life, where identities are shaped, where people find meaning. So it's a really broad term built out of the notion of a democratic public realm in which we all have a voice. Young people, old people, all have a voice. So the paper is really about the public influence of Catholicism thought about on 3 levels. The most obvious is kind of the direct influence of the church through the bishops, through spokespeople, through the national conference, through archdiocese, in shaping public life. But then that's only the most obvious. There's also this deep cultural influence, the way Catholic institutions and Catholic culture shape sources of meaning, shape what people think are important, this issue versus that issue. And then third, at the, kind of the most intimate level, the whole process of identity formation. As we all come of age, but then in an ongoing way throughout adulthood, our identities are constantly being formed, most directly in the church through faith formation kind of work. But the paper talks a lot about the whole nature of spirituality and worship and shared worship settings, the taking of Eucharist, and the way that that shapes identity as well. And that's part of the public influence of the church, even if less directly. So to start with the obvious, there is a true crisis of the public witness of Catholicism in America today. There's this deep sense that the Catholic public voice is no longer credible. And I want to recognize that even as I speak about public Catholicism, but also note that that's not just a crisis of the church. There's actually a wider crisis about the very notion of a democratic public realm, of the notion of shared deliberation based partly on some sense of shared facts, some commitment to the truth, even if that truth is sometimes contested. That's a society-wide crisis that is also reverberating in the church. And in the church, that public voice is under siege, partly because of the erosion of institutions generally, partly because of the erosion of so-called institutionalized religion, even though many of those spiritual, not religious voices, those most critical of institutionalized religion, are often themselves very significant institutions, whether it's New Age spirituality via crystals and bookstores, or non-denominational evangelical churches that criticize institutionalized religion even as they build remarkably large and prosperous institutions. There still has been that kind of an erosion of institutionalized religion. But then in the Catholic world, most especially undermined by the sex abuse scandal and the associated authority scandal of these last 2 decades. And very central to the argument in the chapter is the idea that in addition to all those ways in which Catholic credibility has been undermined, that also the very sectarian tone taken by a lot of Catholic voices since 2000, which both of the prior speakers referred to, beginning about the time, the late 1990s, all the way up until the Francis papacy, that deeply sectarian tone of Catholic voices have really created a sense of Catholicism not as an open tradition in which all can engage, but a much more narrowly constrained tradition. And there's some really good sociological evidence that that is part of what has driven young people out of the church pews. It's that tone that's embarrassing for young people as much as anything about the sex abuse scandal. So the questions underlying this chapter in the book have to do with why is it that the direct Catholic impact on society seems rather thin now? And is there more going on than just this kind of erosion of the Catholic voice? And in particular, how might the public voice of Catholicism be revitalized? After the main themes there have to do with this impressive breadth of the Catholic public witness across 3 terrains. On the top level, kind of ecclesial institutions of the United States Conference, Catholic conferences at the state level, parishes, nonprofits, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, all these incredible network of social service ecclesial institutions. But then at a second level, a whole bunch of other kinds of public institutions. The Supreme Court, most prominently, where 2/3 of the justices are now Catholic. Really influential Catholic voices in various sides in Congress. The important presence of the Catholic Church in universities and colleges around the country, both Catholic colleges and the Catholic witness on big public universities that I argue is especially important as well. And the Catholic presence in those settings is a sort of continuing source of credibility, a really deep social resource for the church going forward. And then at a third level, a much more society-centered grassroots level, this whole set of lay-centered social movements that shape people's identities in important ways. And they vary. I used the example of the pro-life movement on one hand, the voice of the faithful on another hand, and my own research about faith-based community organizing in local settings, state settings, a really important voice of the church in marginalized settings, trying to get government and corporations to better serve the poor in this country. So that's sort of at the level of this very breadth of public witness. Underneath all that, I write about the cultural and institutional dynamics within the church that are really shaping the Catholic future in ways we can't predict the future. I like Joe Kenichi's line about we don't do the future. I'm a sociologist. We sometimes pretend to do the future, but none of us predict the future very well. But at least we can identify the trends, the patterns, the deep forces that are shaping the future. One of them I write about is leadership dynamics in the church, and in particular the lay leaders in a huge range of institutions who think of themselves as Catholic. Many of them still worship and take communion. Some of them feel alienated from the church because of recent dynamics, but still think of themselves as spiritual Catholics, and are desperate for a kind of deep dialogue with Catholic leadership and too often don't find willing partners on the side of the clergy in that kind of dialogue, as Catherine Schuh just referred to. The second of those cultural and institutional dynamics I write about are the authority dynamics within Catholicism, and argue that despite the nature of some forms of Catholic authoritarianism that still prevail sometimes, in particular a kind of overly clerical culture in too many settings, based on the seminary training of many of the recent generations of incoming priests. Alongside that, there's also gestating a really healthy culture of authority in many Catholic settings that's authoritative, not authoritarian, that is, rejects the wider society's notion that all authority is suspect and to be rejected, but also rejects the kind of authoritarianism of a certain kind of Catholicism and the authoritarianism of some of our political culture today, in favor of this healthy dialogical relationship with authority. And then the third of those cultural dynamics that I write about are the spirituality and worship embedded in parishes. And I think it's important when we think about public Catholicism to understand that at that deepest level of identity formation, people's identities are still very deeply shaped by the taking of Eucharist, by the practice of confession, by the prayer lives of young Catholics, older Catholics, the religious education of children in really important ways, and that's shaping identities that matter for the future. On that level of identity formation, I raise questions around just how coherent and vibrant that faith formation is in our parishes today, and how important it is that we revitalizing faith formation efforts. Where they are strong, are they consonant with the full complexity of Catholic teaching, or I fear they're often overly narrow on one or the other side of what Joe Kenichi just framed as the pluriformity, the dual pluriformity of Catholicism. And perhaps most crucially, do Catholic faith formation processes really have enough grip on people's identity to overcome the deep pull of contemporary consumer culture and the deep political polarization and authoritarianism of American political culture today? So in closing, I'd like to, that much is sort of an overall framing of the argument in this chapter. I'd like to close with just reading a bit more formally some of the argument in the book. This comes out of the conclusion. In sum, whether public Catholicism thrives or withers in American society will be shaped by complex dynamics occurring at multiple levels. At the highest level, and then with most obvious and immediate impact, are the public actions of bishops and Catholic leaders of elite institutions. At the lowest level, and with the longest timeline, are the dynamics of authority and identity formation rooted in mass culture and the worship lives of local parishes. In between lies the role of universities, university-linked ministries, and faith formation programs in parishes in shaping future leaders of mediating institutions, and thus bringing the Catholic values, ethos, and worldview into the democratic public arena. And I go on later to say, most obviously, it seems clear that the Catholic Church remains enormously well-positioned to influence public debate across a variety of issues. With the strong institutional presence in neighborhoods via faith-based organizing, the educational field, the legal and political systems, and the public communications media, the potential, and I emphasize potential Catholic voice in the societal conversation underlying American democracy is impressive. This is all the more true given the status of American Catholics as an important swing constituency in national elections. By that I mean the way that Catholics split across recent presidential elections, swinging very strongly to Obama, white Catholics swinging very strongly to Trump more recently. As a swing constituency, that vote is crucial, but also among Latinos, the largest emerging ethnic vote now and in coming decades in this country. An appropriate understanding of the parallel structures of authority operative within church and society can help leaders of public Catholicism effectively operate in the public arena. In doing so, they can offer the wisdom of the Catholic tradition to American society as it seeks to define its future. Doing so can help the leaders of public Catholicism, by which I mean all of us, to gradually revise Catholic self-understanding in light of the tradition's ongoing experience and history. Something akin to this is clearly the inspiring vision that animated the Second Vatican Council. Liberals tend to affirm the revised tradition side of that equation, and conservatives to affirm the wisdom of the tradition side. But either stance by itself is surely inadequate. If public Catholicism is not to squander the remarkable institutional resources on which it can draw to influence American culture and society, its leaders will have to forego the effort to produce change by fiat and instead engage in societal dialogue on the terms of the democratic public arena. This, in turn, will require a new interface between the cultural modes of authority operative within the church and society. I then speak about the Catholic moment, and then the last paragraph of the book argues, yet an important Catholic moment may endure. The institutional and cultural presence of the Catholic tradition in American life makes its public role significant. The tradition's continuing intellectual depth, usually, its non-sectarian ethos, its constructive engagement with competing religious traditions, and voice on key questions facing society make its public role important. And America's contemporary situation makes the Church's public role vital. Our democracy faces vast challenges in the 21st century, and America will only succeed in addressing those challenges via active engagement with diverse ethical traditions. Roman Catholicism clearly represents one crucial such ethical tradition. A Catholic moment may thus endure, but if so, it must simultaneously be humbler and more confident, simultaneously less triumphal and yet fully engaged in public life. In short, it must be both more Catholic in its ecclesiology and more Catholic in its politics. Thank you all. It's great to be here with you.
I'm going to get up so I don't have to move the microphone for the speakers.
I was asked to give about 5 minutes for the commentary, but I want to carve out as much time as I can for your questions from this distinguished panel. Let me just give a couple of overarching observations and that are informed by my own experience. It seems to me that one of the threads that runs through all of these is a recognition of the need for multiplicity of voices. To me, that's been always the attraction of at least my understanding of what it meant to be Catholic. And so you see the tensions that Joseph talked about early in the first presentation. And I was raised in the midst of those tensions. I mean, what is it? I was raised in one of those parish compounds in which we sang an army of youths flying the banner of truth. We are fighting for Christ our Lord. It was a very openly defiant, us against them sort of mentality, especially in the South where I was raised. We raised our children to believe that we were not better or worse than anybody because we were Catholic. And my goodness, they took us at our word. So what does it mean to raise your children as Catholic? And I think that all three of the panelists have tried to address what those how do you raise your children and future generations to believe in something distinctively Catholic, if that still exists, but also to raise them to operate within this pluralistic society. How do they understand themselves to be Catholic? Certainly in Katerina's remarks, this notion of pastors having to be more CEOs or branch managers than to be pastoral is a real problem, regardless of whether you're a Vatican II priest or a JP2 priest. And so how do we get parishes to function as vital centers of Catholic identity and spirituality, especially when the one person, perhaps, who's listed on the masthead is busy trying to figure out how to fix the plumbing, right? So, and we used to rely on free labor, right? We had nuns. We had wives who their job was to fill in all these different roles, and that's not there anymore. So what do we do to encourage a real investment in terms of a vital parish life? And finally, in terms of what shapes our identity and what shapes public's understanding of what it means to be a Catholic voice in culture, is quite striking to me because a lot of my research is in film criticism, television criticism. And you find, in my opinion, 3 levels of the Catholic voice, so I'm just going to talk about film. You find overt depictions of Catholicism, as you saw in Doubt, or Spotlight, or Sister Act. You find you find different kinds of that are more subtle or dropped in. And I'm struck by the 2 films that I saw in the last couple of years. One is called Puzzle, in which, charming film about a woman who does jigsaw puzzles. Oh my goodness, she's Catholic. And then it's sort of never mentioned again, but somehow the director or the writer thought, we're just going to drop this in here and then not talk about it. So what does that do for our understanding of Catholicism? On a more serious level, you have something like 3 billboards. What is it, 3 billboards?
Outside of Edmond.
Outside, yeah.
That's right.
I don't know if you saw this, but if you saw it, you surely remember the confrontation between the Francis McDormand character and the parish priest. Catholicism is never mentioned again, but there is this searing confrontation in which the Francis McDormand character says, in essence, I won't repeat it because there's lots of obscenity in it, but she says to him, who do you think you are to talk to me about ethical issues or spirituality? Look at your own church. You joined the Brotherhood. What does that mean? All right, so this notion of who gets to be the voice of the Catholic Church, we heard last night the notion of integrity, credibility. I think we see that dropped into films. And then you see the more subtle depictions of what it means to be a Catholic voice. So you see somebody like Tom Fontana, who wrote and produced and directed the television series Oz, which, I mean, aside from Rita Moreno, really doesn't talk about Catholicism, but he says it's all about Catholicism. It's all about forgiveness. It's all about negotiating our broken nature in the world. So this issue of who gets to be a voice, who gets to represent Catholicism, how it shapes our identity, and how we talk to one another about the very legitimate differences is a really compelling issue for me, and why I so appreciate the contributions and the remarks that these 3 panelists made. So with that, we open it up. We've got about 20 minutes. We're going to open it up to, we've got a floating mic, roving mic, and a reminder that this is not a time for you to make that speech. You've been waiting. This is a time for questions, primarily for our panelists.
Father Larry Delling from St. Agatha Church in Chicago. The one question I would have is for the panel is, do you think that this is a time for a lay movement that can be separate from, perhaps on the fringe, but still connected to the church, but from a distance, from the center, that can stand up and address the sins of the church? So, for example, a lay group focused solely on how do we address the sexual abuse crisis, not only in the church, but in society in general. You know, how do we stand as people of faith, Catholics, who realize that we have learned so much from this crisis, how much we have learned about how we minister to people, how we can minister to people, about just all the different aspects of this, and then bring that as a lay community of Catholics, separate from the bishops, separate from the priests, but still connected to the church at a distance in a way that I think St. Francis and Clare did in many ways, kind of, you know, still centered by the church, but always on the fringe. Is that a possibility, or are we still captive to the endorsement of bishops and priests in doing that?
Well, I
take
think
it
it's a
first.
possibility, I don't think it's desirable. I think that the church is already pretty much now fractured into lay hierarchical divisions for multiple reasons. So I think at the time, and I think we have to be patient with that. So there might be a possibility for, or opportunity for a lay group such as you speak, but I hope it would be only temporary. I think what needs to happen is we have to have some courageous lay, religious, priestly, and hierarchical leaders who are willing to meet in the same group and carve out a middle path through dialogue and hard work, men and women together, so that we meet together in a common space of brothers and sisters. That would be I think the methodology that could possibly move us forward. I think in the present context, any group of higher bishops, priests, or lay people meeting by themselves will be talking to themselves.
Richard, you had a thought on that?
Yeah, though Joe's smart comment has me reflecting more fully, but my initial thought anyway is I do think such movements exist already. The difficulty is that so many of them are captured by exactly the polarized dynamics that Joe's describing and Katharina described in terms of the clericalism as well. And so finding that middle ground is the hard part. I do think we have some bishop leaders now entirely oriented and capable of playing that role. The trouble is their every action gets interpreted through the lens of this polarization, even when they're not embedded in that polarization themselves. Francis has a vision for this as well, as noted earlier. I guess lastly, I would say that most people of younger middle age and above, so my generation, older generations, and the next generation younger than me, I think most of us are just too bound up in the past dynamics. Some of the leadership, I think, is going to have to come from young adults today, thinking this through carefully. Of course, some of them are embedded in the same problems, but really smart leadership from the next generation, calling the church to be true to its deepest self, I think can gain some credibility in some important ways.
I would add a little bit to that. I have worked a lot on the sexual abuse situation. I was part of the John Jay study for 6 years on the causes and context, and therefore have been in groups many, many times in the last several years where these discussions have taken place. And a number of them have been without clergy, or at least without bishops present. More likely that clergy would be present, but not the bishops. And people who have a good deal of knowledge about the situation, legal, medical, all kinds of social workers, people who have insights of how to work with the problems. And that, I think, is extremely valuable. I think of it more as local or regional rather than a national movement. It's not so much a movement, but it's meetings to say, how can we help this situation? How can we get over it? The other thing, I think, is just lack of knowledge among people about sexual abuse, the crisis itself. For example, I gave a talk recently in Rochester, Minnesota, where there are lots of medical people, and I gave the statistics of the change from hundreds, thousands of abuse cases before 2002. Since 2004, when the new set of statistics was gathered, there have been about an average of 20 cases per year in the whole United States, compared to 500, 1,000 a year back in the 70s. So, and they were shocked to hear that and said, oh, we're so glad to hear that the church is actually doing something about this. So I think the lack of knowledge is the first step. And the more that can be delivered by people who are not clergy or bishops, the better, I think. And I've been in a number of other situations with the main John Jay researchers that they just do a world of good. They're not Catholic, and they are able to speak just with complete authenticity and are highly respected. So I think that's the kind of thing that I would see more valuable than a movement thing, which I think will not serve well. One of the people who's in a group that I've been part of is a member of the Focolari, and she talked about the importance of pondering, that we talk so much and we want to keep expressing our ideas, and they're often just repetitions, that if we just stop talking and ponder, and actually in that meeting, we stopped for a few minutes, and the comments after that were a little more thoughtful. So I think there are lots of things like that.
Thank you, everybody, for your input on this. I'm wondering, and have wondered for a while now, if whether the categories of religious and lay are not dysfunctional categories for the future. And indeed, if those categories that we have traditionally thought in are holding us back to encounter what the future might unfold as. And I wish I had an answer to my own question, but I don't, so I pose it to everyone here.
Bill, did you want to talk to that? Or-
No, I'll ask a question.
I think one of the difficulties is the historical amnesia with respect to how the council tried to set this up when it talked in Lumen Gentium, first about Trinity and then about the people of God. Everyone belongs to the people of God, and the commonality of baptism, for example, and that should be foundational in parish life, in the relationships between laity and clergy, between men and women. And the movement away from the people of God has its historical roots and reasons and things like that, but we've gone back now to a classical, canonical definition where you only have two sectors of the church spoken of, the hierarchy and laity. And the religious are part of the laity. The religious who provided the mediating spaces in the past are declining and disappearing. And so now you have basically, given in this culture, two political forces, each vying for the control of public space. And so I think that's part of the argument. And we have to, linguistically, I think you make a good point, go back to the fact that we're a people of God first, sharing the baptism. I think it may be possible to recover that language now as it became confused with democratic political processes in the course of the 70s and 80s. I think we're able to divorce it. It's a spiritual and theological category. It's not a political category. The people of God coming out of the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament. Going back to that is important. And then even when it talks about the ministerial priesthood and the priesthood of all believers, it says they're ordered to each other. That one cannot exist without the other. And we have to, that implies a mutuality of exchange and a space between people where there's a practice of exchange, charity, humility, willingness to learn, and the recognition of differences and different gifts. There's a lot of things we need to recover, I think, that simply got blown away in the context of the 70s and 80s. Council, I think, was pretty correct.
Other thoughts on this?
Just a quick thought. I do think the current culture of clericalism and authoritarianism that's embodied in those categories is deeply dysfunctional, as the question suggests. I'm not sure that means the set of categories themselves are. I think there's still deep charisms embedded in those distinctions. But I trust that in the wisdom of the Holy Spirit in the years to come, the church will be asking itself whether that implies an all-male clerical structure and an all celibate clerical structure. There may be ways of differentiating that in ways that are more true to the Spirit.
Thank you. Other questions?
Oh, thank you. So, Joe, this may be to you, and Richard also. I'm just curious about your sense of, I like the idea of the Catholics bonding, so to speak, with mainland Protestants in the context of the Civil Rights Movement, okay, at that moment, and then later the Catholic evangelicals as a kind of religio-culture or culture wars bondedness. Do you think we're at a point today where there's a kind of bonding going on, if you will, between Catholics or certain Catholic quarters and what I'd call a kind of libertarian neoliberalism that's likely to have some, I think, very significant implications for how Catholic social teachings are being purveyed in the public domain? Or is that something that isn't of the significance of these two earlier types of bonding, or is more regional, or just in some particular Catholic institutions and what have you? It's a kind of speculative question of sorts. And
I mean, I guess
Recently, one of the most prominent intellectual historians of the U.S., Daniel Rogers, Age of Fracture, has argued, I think very persuasively in many different cultural fields, for the dominance of the market, neoliberal market model as the sole bond that binds people together. And I think that's pervasive, culturally, and many in the Catholic community have picked it up and use money and power to influence both the church and the direction of religion, separating it from public life, and certainly picking up only those parts of the Catholic social teaching that are compatible with that vision. So I think that's a real problem. Is it an alliance along the ecumenical lines I spoke of? I'm not sure, but it's definitely a change, and it's going to affect the Catholic social teaching that has to come to grips with the neoliberal market model that is connected with globalization.
thank you.
Richard?
If folks don't mind a little theological and scriptural reflection from a sociologist, I think Bill's absolutely right. The trouble is, as soon as one names it in those terms of neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, you will be perceived as embodying the left side of that very polarization that we're talking about. When in fact it's a good analytic question, right? Have elements of the church been colonized by this sort of form of thought that is deeply against the tradition, even as it claims to speak in the name of the tradition? So I want to talk about the tone of our whole discussion this morning that presumes that conflict in the church is a bad thing, I think, and question whether that's the case. If it's true that some segments of the church have come to embrace, mostly with very good intent, and yet come to embrace a set of teachings and philosophical assumptions that deeply contradict the very foundations of the Catholic faith, we're going to have conflict in the church to come to terms with that. And we are going to have the courage to step into that conflict and name things for what they are. One of my favorite books is by a Mexican Jesuit named Carlos Bravo. It's called Jesus, Hombre en Conflicto, Jesus, Man in Conflict. Analyzes the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the Gospels, arguing, you only understand the Gospel. Either way, the entire set of action pivots on 3 or 4 moments when Jesus enters into conflict with every assumption of his society. Most prominently when he turns to the Pharisees and says, you whiten sepulchres, right? He's not playing nice. He's denouncing what he believes to be the deep distortion of his tradition, of the Jewish tradition at this time. And so I think let's not fall into assuming in our middle-class lives that somehow conflict is a bad thing. I think in the church we will have to live into this conflict in the name of not accepting the notion that some who present themselves as voices of moral purity and orthodoxy in the church may in fact be voices of heresy and sectarianism in the church. That's going to generate conflict. Hopefully we don't stay at that level, but also enter into Eucharistic communion with people, dialogue with others, shared discernment, even across those lines of conflict. To me, that's the true call of the church, not avoiding the conflict altogether.
All right, Katerina has some remarks, and then we're gonna try to wrap it up, if that's okay? So.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think that much of church life still happens in parishes, and the outreach that goes on from parishes. The truth of the matter is parishes have become very unified, but very singular in who is accepted there. I think this is one of the problems for young people. When you move to a place, where do you go? Churches are so divided individually by parish. It's the conflict among parishes, not within, that I think is much more of the problem. And the dysfunction comes when a priest enters a parish who is very different from what that parish has grown up to be. And that kind of conflict, I don't see any kind of health that's worthwhile there, or much worthwhile. So I think it's a larger situation that we're talking about. But the daily life or the average Catholic is not involved in the kinds of things that we're talking about.